Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Simple and Cost-Effective Ways to Engage Patients Using eCOA and IRT Systems. My name is Nima, and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for future download. At this point, I'd like to thank YPrime, who helped to develop the content for this presentation. YPrime offers more than a decade of focused work with eClinical systems to expedite and improve the quality of patient management, clinical supplies, drug accountability, and clinical data. Cloud-based interactive response technology and electronic clinical outcome assessment platforms offer sponsors great speed, precision, and integration in clinical trial management. Their data services and tools help sponsors bring together fragmented clinical research data into contextual information that they can act on. YPrime's technology and service offerings enable sponsors to move faster and more efficiently to do their next development milestone. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Bryan Clayton. As Vice President of Strategic Solutions, Bryan Clayton collaborates with biopharma executives, clinical operations, and supply teams to define, plan, and implement eClinical technology. Prior to his appointment in business development leadership, Bryan spent more than 5 years in operational roles involving eClinical products. Most recently, he served as manager of R&D for YPrime's interactive response technology. Earlier, he oversaw project management and the teams responsible for IRT implementation at Senduit. Throughout his career, Bryan has led numerous integrations between eClinical systems, third-party data sources, and various device types. Carrie Lewis is Associate Director of Clinical Operations for Lupin Research Inc. She oversees global program management for clinical development involving multiple therapeutic areas, spanning respiratory, central nervous system, vaccine therapy, and women's health. Carrie is a specialist in clinical trial operations, outsourcing management, and process improvement with nearly 15 years of clinical research experience within sponsor companies, contract research organizations, and academia. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over our control to our very first speaker, Bryan Clayton. Bryan, you may begin your presentation when you are ready.
Thank you very much, and everyone, welcome. We appreciate you joining us today. I am Bryan Clayton, the Vice President of Strategic Solutions here at YPrime, and I appreciate you joining us. We're going to talk today about some simple and cost-effective ways to engage patients using eCOA and IRT systems. Our agenda is fairly straightforward. We'll scope our discussion first, then we'll go into some key themes and some supporting features, and all of this will be revolving around the eCOA and IRT unified platform. Then we'll wrap up with a case study, which will demonstrate how YPrime was able to implement some of these ideas in a real study. Now, before we go too much further, I'd like to maybe start by asking a polling question.
All right, everyone, our first polling question will be launched on your screen right now. So our polling question here is, sponsors, does your company incorporate patient engagement into clinical development? We have 4 options here, and I encourage audience members to please vote on this in real time, and we'll take a look at the results. So our first option here is yes, it's well established. Our second option here is yes, but partially developed, used selectively. Third option is no, we're exploring ways to implement. And our last option is not at this time. So it looks like most of the audience members have voted on this question, so let's see how the results look. All right, such interesting results. 18% of the audience has selected the first option. Yes, it's well established. 35% of the audience has selected the second option. Yes, but partially developed, used selectively. 18% of the audience has selected the third option. No, we're exploring ways to implement. And 29% of the audience members have selected the last option, not at this time. Now back to you, Bryan.
Well, thank you very much for that. Certainly interesting results there across the 4 different options. Based on those results, really, I think we can determine patient engagement means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So perhaps we can begin maybe by defining the scope of today's discussion. Some sponsors have adopted patient engagement as a life cycle approach, meaning that the dialogue with patients about their preferences and their unmet needs and those types of things begins pretty early in the clinical development process, even before the teams are thinking about protocol design or a specific upcoming clinical trial. About other companies, especially sometimes some smaller biotech and smaller pharma companies, really don't start incorporating patient engagement ideas until later when they're actually in the clinical trial stages. And that may be just by introducing some education things or trying to provide some more convenience and support mechanisms during the subject's participation. With that said, though, patient engagement really, it's a very broad topic, and it's easy for many companies to become overwhelmed really about where to start. It is possible, though, and practical to start small. You don't have to jump into this head first. You can look at some of your existing technology solutions. Specifically today, we'll look at ways you can use your IRT and your eCOA platforms, which are already regulatory approved, are 21 CFR Part 11 compliant, and really are existing technologies within most clinical trials today. So really, there's so many different converging trends, namely, we've seen such an emergence of educated, digital savvy patients and more sophisticated technology. And with that, there's a huge opportunity to take patient engagement into clinical trials and really for the trials which they're there, take them to the next level. So regardless of when a sponsor chooses to initiate patient engagement during clinical development, there's a few common elements that we'll talk about. And one is providing user experiences that digital patients demand. And that could be better engagement in the form of interactive communications, could be transparent communications, and really other just relevant information. And the other idea here is treating patients like contributors rather than just treating them like research subjects. And really, that's not hard to do. And then really finding out more information from the patient and how they would like to receive information in the future. Some examples is let's ask patients up front, maybe even during the consent stage, on how they would prefer to receive communications, and then follow through for the rest of the trial in that method. And last, let's make more efficient use of the existing technology out there instead of adding additional systems or additional interfaces. And we all know that additional systems interfaces cost money, take time to develop, and really clinical trials have enough disparate systems as it is already. So the first technology that we'll talk about today is eCOA. And just for a moment here, many of us understand this eCOA acronym, but I'll just unpack it slightly here. eCOA is Electronic Clinical Outcome Assessments, which is an umbrella term for electronic patient-reported outcomes, clinician-reported outcomes, observer-reported outcomes, performance outcomes. Several different types of outcomes really fall under the umbrella of eCOA. And eCOA really has transformed the way we interact with patients during a clinical trial. We have technology that sits directly in the hands of the patients, which opens up a lot of possibilities to engage in additional data collection. Really, eCOA is one of the very few direct patient-facing systems that we have in clinical research. So you can gather real-time insights and feedback straight from the ePro devices. Data is oftentimes collected from those patients using a provisioned smartphone. Sometimes we'll see them using a bring your own device type of smartphone. And that's great because it fits fairly elegantly into the patient's existing digital lifestyle. The eCOA technology can be designed to multitask in a trial. It can add features to patients that they're already accustomed to in their consumer apps. It'll increase usability. It'll make the interaction more useful. And in a lot of ways, it can help it make the participation in the trial a lot more fun. So when we take the eCOA and we unify it with an IRT system, that data integration allows for richer insights and can help you to deliver more personalized communication, and certainly adds convenience. So next we'll go to IRT, and IRT stands for Interactive Response Technology. You may have heard it as IVRS or IWRS, maybe even RTSM, which is Randomization and Trial Supply Management. But no matter what you call it, IRT is typically not seen as a patient-facing interface. That said, there's plenty of utility for communicating securely and directly in a private manner with the patient, which stems from the IRT system. Today's IRT systems really are much more flexible and adaptable than they once were. And they're providing ability to integrate multiple data streams within real-time data capabilities. So you can make some changes to the system shortly after go live these days. If you've got protocol amendments down the line, we can make those changes fairly quickly in today's systems. It really depends upon what your communication needs are that arise throughout the trial. And again, the thing to remember about IRT, similarly to how eCOA is one of the only patient-facing systems, IRT is really one of the only real-time systems. And what we mean by that is as soon as a patient is randomized, it's done in the IRT and we know that subject status. When a subject is dispensed drug at a treatment visit, we know that that treatment visit has occurred in real time because of the IRT. So again, when the IRT application is unified with the eCOA, each application allows for just richer data exchange and more possibilities to take patient engagement to the next level. So with that, let's talk about how we're defining some different themes within patient engagement. Across these four areas, there's a number of features available through eCOA or through IRT and the platforms themselves to engage patients in a few different ways. And we've categorized these as best as we can, but there's probably a little bit of overlap between some of these categories. Some of the features could probably fit into multiple categories here. But really the takeaway is we wanted to show you a snapshot of some of the engagement possibilities simply through your existing eCOA or IRT platforms. And now we'll go into a little bit more detail in each of these categories in these upcoming slides. So we'll start here with medication and regimen adherence. And this engagement tool is probably the most familiar for a lot of people. It's a simple tool. It improves compliance and adherence when it's used properly. And what we're talking about is alerts and notifications are really where the automated compliance features began. And as technology has evolved in the past few years, patients are prompted to take medication, they can record health data, information about quality of life, and oftentimes we're seeing reminders to attend site visits and things to that effect. And these notifications and customized messaging can be triggered by any number of transactions, either in the IRT or on the eCOA side. And the technology in many applications now even allowing to sync your calendar from your eCOA app directly to the patient's calendar. So if you're working from a unified platform, the way these two systems can now allow for richer communication and provide better support for and early warnings for potential compliance and adherence is really evolved significantly in recent years. Next here, we'll talk about some targeted two-way communications and how technology is not only facilitating scheduled communications based on triggers, but it's also really providing ad hoc communication possibilities as well. So we have an example here, and in this example, the eCOA app is letting a patient contact the site staff or help desk directly with one-click access, really when the need arises. Really, you probably design a number of communications to address a range of scenarios that many of you may be thinking of right now. For example, let's say that a patient doesn't complete a questionnaire on the eCOA device. Well, where we are today is we can generate alerts to let the site know that there's some data that's missing. The site can then reach out to the patient directly to find out if something's wrong. Maybe they forgot their device and went on vacation, something to that effect. And we've also seen alerts generated that go to monitors for similar situations, which can help the sponsor facilitate the risk-based monitoring plan. In some cases, again, if the visit design allows for it, patients are also even able to reschedule their appointments through their handheld device. Now, none of this is groundbreaking technology at all. A lot of these features exist in your everyday digital consumer applications you have today. So if we're already doing this in our existing mobile health applications, why not incorporate some of these things into our clinical trial apps as well? Now, one of the areas that we said kind of overlaps a couple of our themes here certainly is gamification. And to define it a bit, gamification really is a way of providing recognition and incentives to help make clinical trial participants more competitive, perhaps, and just in general have fun and be more interactive through things like graphics, point systems, trophy cases, maybe like a badge system. And there's a few different ways that we can do that. Maybe we'd start with diagnosis, which is something that's been around for quite some time. There's probably a handful of tools that you all know of that are very game-like, things like cognitive assessments that happen up front to help with selection and assessment of clinical trial participants. But then beyond that, really truly gamified clinical trial apps can also help to educate people to understand the clinical trial process by explaining the risks and benefits of participating in a more digestible, more interactive way. So there's some common elements such as rewarding achievements and inspiring friendly competition that can help motivate not only patients, but also help to boost site performance for areas such as things like activation, patient enrollment, and many more things as well. For patients, gamification encourages behavior change and also protocol compliance, which can have a direct result in decreasing early termination rates. So patients are continually monitoring their progress, measuring whether they are meeting goals, and that can really kind of help to offset some of the drudgery of protocol compliance when you think about long times between visits or studies that are many years in duration. Really providing some tools to help encourage the patients and keep them engaged and motivated throughout those long trials is ultimately going to help reduce dropout rate and encourage participants to continue and complete the trial. We've also seen some IRB approved incentives like low value gift cards commonly, as well as even some charity donations for patients based upon their compliance here. So we probably do need a little bit more research to determine just exactly how effective gamification has been in clinical research. But there's a handful of companies and different trial networks and such that are already using gamification in ongoing research. So I'm willing to bet we can expect to see more and more gamification deployed in these eCOA systems as time goes on. All right, so next we'll talk for a moment about some education and information sharing. And part of the problem here with recruitment and retention boils down to awareness, understanding, and in a lot of ways, trust. Trust of the pharmaceutical industry, perhaps, trust of the clinical research industry. And educating potential participants is key to recruitment and consent process, but we also need to reinforce this throughout the entire trial, not just up front at consent. So you can find out upfront what format a patient would prefer to receive information, whether that's email or text message or even push notification within the app, and then use that format consistently throughout the trial to communicate with the patient. You can also then allow for patients to share a trial with another patient. We all know how popular patient networks are these days, so perhaps within one of these apps, we're simply hitting a share button and we can share the trial with other patients within their trial, or excuse me, within their patient network. What I think it's worth noting here that information sharing is really a growing expectation from patients. And we've seen some recent studies that are starting to show that most clinical trial participants want to know really what the research community has learned from their participation in their trials. So even though we're seeing that in studies and in questionnaires, most patients still never hear from the sponsor or from the research site staff after they've concluded the clinical trial. So during your trial, again, if your design allows for it, you can share clinical and lab data directly with the participant, perhaps. And providing trial results in lay language or plain language that's easily digestible and understandable to the clinical trial participants is an initiative that's probably still in its infancy, but is gaining a lot of momentum. Sponsors and industry leaders are beginning to talk about this for sure, but the big thing is that e-patients are actually demanding it. So while we're talking about it, the patients on the other side are absolutely demanding it. There's a few examples. You could probably do a quick Google search to find some of these companies, some high-profile pharma companies who have committed to providing summaries of trial findings and even some of the things like lab results and things like that to the clinical trial participants. It's a growing trend for sure. And there's an opportunity out there to use your existing eClinical systems to provide that information to your patients right now, as we said before, without having to add new systems and take on additional cost. So sponsors are beginning to talk to us about how the unified platform between IRT and eCOA can be used to communicate patient results and treatment arm information after CSR even. And after the trial is ended, they're looking for email type communications, perhaps that can provide trial summary information or even links to other online resources. So just about wrapping up this first part of our talk here, certainly YPrime's not the only provider out there, but we certainly are one of the few who's building these applications, these IRT and eCOA shared environments on a unified platform using a single database and a single web code as well. So the architecture and the platform and the core services and all, they're really built with a cross-platform ecosystem in mind, and that eliminates the redundancy of data silos. It eliminates the possibility for data interference when things like, an SFTP password expires and causes an integration to break. With the unified platform from YPrime, data entry into an IRT system is effectively the same as entry into an eCOA system. Again, it eliminates that repetitive data creation. So as the study progresses, shared data are simultaneously updated between the two systems because it's all one central point. At the beginning of the study, eCOA data can be used to gauge eligibility, and then during the study, some of that same eCOA data can be used to monitor drug compliance, and then we package that together, push it onto the IRT side of the system, and that drug compliance information can very easily be used for reconciliation, accountability, and returns, and things like that. So overall, there's a lot more automation, there's considerably less risk, and there's less redundancy in the data, which allows for richer data interaction you can use to build a pretty elegant and effective patient engagement program. So with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Carrie Lewis, who will be explaining one of the ways that YPrime was able to support a sponsor in a real trial and make some of this reality.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here today to tell you about a patient newsletter case study. Also, my legal team wanted to be sure I let everyone know that the contents of this presentation are the personal views of myself, the speaker, and not those of Lupin Pharmaceuticals, Inc., its affiliates, stakeholders, or employees. So to start with, we'll start with a polling question.
All right, everyone. So our second polling question is being launched on our screens right now. So the question is, sponsors, has your company ever used communication, such as a newsletter, to engage patients in a clinical trial? So this is a yes or no answer here, and I encourage our audience members to please vote in real time, and we'll take a look at the results. All right, so it seems that the audience members have voted, so let's see the results. So 57% of audience members have selected yes, and 43% of audience members have selected no. Such interesting results. Now back to you, Carrie.
Great. So it looks like overwhelmingly 57% of you guys are kind of already used to this idea of engaging your patients. So hopefully you'll find this very interesting. So today we are going to discuss why did Lupin choose this method for engaging our patients? What exactly did we do? What did our patients say about this initiative? What was our return on investment? And then end with, why is this such a simple and cost-effective initiative? So why did we do this? Patient engagement has been discussed at almost every conference we attended. So we wanted to see how we could start engaging our patients. However, we did not want to burden our sites with one more website to log into or more data to enter. So we needed a simple solution. We also needed a cost-effective initiative. Because the staff in the U.S. clinical operations team functions with a team of only 5 people, and we are challenged almost daily to cut costs. So we needed a way to engage our patients with limited spend. Lastly, we wanted our sites and patients to embrace embrace our initiative and find it favorable. So from there grew the idea of the IRT direct patient newsletters. So what exactly did we do? So YPrime created the system, and then Lupin created the newsletter detail. The newsletters were sent directly to patients via email through our IRT system. The newsletters were HIPAA compliant. The patients gave written consent to receive the newsletters via the informed consent. And all content, of course, was IRB approved prior to sending to our patients. Our newsletters were created in Microsoft Publisher internally. We converted the final version to PDF for the patients. We included such items such as a welcome, information on Lupin, information on clinical research, some key study reminders, and a thank you for participating. We also included our current enrollment numbers and some fun quotes and pictures. The newsletters were about 2 to 4 pages to keep it short so that they would stay engaged. Our newsletters were created during the IRT build. We sent the newsletters at specified visits. For us, we chose 5 visits that we felt were key. They were such things as screening, randomization, and their last visit. Probably one of my favorite features of this system is the ad hoc feature. This feature allows you to send a newsletter at any time with just a simple click of the button. So for us, we saw some compliance issues, so we created a newsletter in about 1 to 2 days. Then we had the IRB approve it, of course. All of our sites were central IRB, so it was approved in about 2 days. So under just 1 week, we were able to address an issue directly with our patients. We also sent a survey to the patients through this function to get feedback from them. So this system allows you for planned newsletters, the ones we created during the IRT build, and then reactive newsletters through this ad hoc function. So what exactly did the patients think of the newsletters? 87% did prefer email as the method of delivery. 79% would like to receive post-study updates, such as study results. And 87% recommend us to use them in the future. So we did think it would be nice to include some direct quotes from the patients to showcase their thoughts. So to start with, the information in the newsletters are very helpful. The more information you share with us, the more informed I am. I did this study to also learn more about the effectiveness of the medicine in others. So I think this quote is really important as it shows that the patients want to learn more and be educated about clinical research and the medication. Next, the newsletter is very basic, but serves to maintain visibility. I think it serves its purpose adequately. So here, a simple, basic idea can still help the patients feel engaged. Consider more information about COPD and exactly how the medication works to relieve symptoms. Our study coordinator provided excellent information regarding how to use the diary. Also, more information on Lupin. What are their medications they're responsible for, size of the company, etc. So this quote really showed me that I need to expand on telling patients more about the sponsor. To be honest, many in the industry don't always know who Lupin is, so it makes sense our patients would like to know more. Also, to be honest, our website isn't really the most clear, so I can see where adding more information on our medications, etc. would help them. Actually, a bit more detail about the study and results to date would be beneficial. I think this quote really shows that we can do a better job at educating our patients. This is a double-blind study, so we cannot share any results during the study, but perhaps patients think we have results and are simply not sharing. Thus, I think it's important to briefly describe the timelines to patients, such as the length of the study and the time to post the results. This can take many years, and patients may think that when they complete their last visit, we have results. And the last quote basically reinforces and encourages participant awareness. Would like to see some basic data, such as average improvement and distribution. So now moving on to your return on investment. So if you're like me, you must explain to senior management your return on investment before you can add any new initiatives or increase your costs. So when we looked at our data back in September, we were very pleased to see that the data suggests that subscribers of the newsletter are less likely to early term. That was great news, because if your ET rate is higher than projected, that could lead to increased sample size, which of course increases your timelines and your cost. The other item our data showed us is that those that subscribed to the newsletter, none of them had ET due to noncompliance. Earlier, we discussed that sending the ad hoc newsletter for compliance issue. So possibly this shows us that the ad hoc newsletter helped our ET rate as well. So of course, our study is ongoing, so we'll continue to watch this as the study progresses to see if our retention trend continues. So we discussed how ET rate can affect your sample size. Well, deviations can do so as well. So if we have too many major deviations, then we may need to increase our sample size to ensure we have sufficient per protocol completers. Therefore, it is essential for clinical operations to keep their deviation rate low and to our projections. So we were excited when we saw that by sending the ad hoc diary reminders directly to the patients, we believe that this possibly assisted with dropping the diary-related deviation rate by almost 50%. So prior to our ad hoc newsletter, we had about 20 diary-related deviations, and then once we sent the newsletter and continued to review our deviations, it had dropped to about 11. Thus, we believe that the direct-to-patient newsletter, of course, along with some site retraining, helped the team to decrease the deviations seen in regard to diary and noncompliance. So I think it's important to explain why is this initiative so simple and cost-effective. So for this Lupin study, and please keep in mind every study is different in their cost, but for this particular study, this service actually paid for itself if we simply retained just one patient. So when we discussed earlier our early term rate, that already occurred for us. Lupin's U.S. clinical operations team has limited resource with a staff of 5 employees. So it was really key that we kept this initiative to minimal Lupin hours. Also, this required no increase to CRO hours and therefore did not result in additional fees. And my favorite part of this initiative is that it required 0 additional hours for the site staff, which is key as our sites are already very busy and they have to manage numerous systems. So our sites simply had to enter the patient's email address if they consented at the screening visit while they were in the IRT system. So what are our next steps? We want to take that patient feedback and improve our next newsletter. We want to include more detail on the sponsor and expand on the medication and indication. And one of my big goals is to provide the study data to patients once it's made public on clinicaltrials.gov. So of course they can go online at any time and see this, but is it really that easy for them? They have no idea when the results will be posted to then go back and look for them. And it's already public knowledge, so why not just send it directly to them to ease the burden? Also, why not make the patients aware when our product gets approved? Without the patients, we would not have an approved product, so why not thank them at that time? Again, the approval is public knowledge, but I think it's very hard for patients to really know that that approval matches that study they participated in. So in closing, I want to challenge everyone to stand in our patients' shoes. Last week at a conference, I was really inspired by someone. We were speaking on patient engagement, and he asked the room, how many of us have participated in a study ourselves? Very few raised their hands. That struck me because I feel we expect a lot of our patients, and we ourselves in the industry have hardly put ourselves out there and volunteered our time to a clinical study. So next time you see a study you could qualify for, I challenge you to volunteer and see what it's like. Also, maybe next time you ask yourself, gosh, why did that patient do that? Think, what would you have done in that situation? Remember, without patients, we cannot have clinical studies and make progress in the medical field. So thank you everyone for your time, and now we can open it up to questions.
Well, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. Now, I would like to invite our audience to continue sending in their questions using the questions chat box. And we've already received a few questions, so I'll start with those. So our first question here is for Bryan. How do you handle patient communications after a trial has ended? For example, providing study results to participants.
Great question. It's actually one of my favorite topics. So fortunately, the database contains a fair amount of information about the patient that we collect during the either consent process or screening process. As an example, if we're sending patient newsletters in the case that Carrie was talking about, we've got a subject email address that is hashed and stored securely inside of our database and isn't visible to anyone. And that email certainly is tied to the information that we receive about the patient from the eCOA, could be their treatment arm information. So in order to provide information to a patient after database lock, it is a simple matter of getting another IRB approved communication that would go out to the patients. That would probably be something that the sponsor would put together to match their needs. And we would just distribute that communication in the same way that we were able to distribute other communications throughout the trial, similarly to what Carrie talked about in the patient newsletter system.
All right, thank you for that answer. Our next question here is for Carrie. How do you manage a patient newsletter using a local versus central IRB?
Okay, great question. So of course, a central IRB is much simpler. It's one IRB, one review, same timelines for all sites. However, I do think this function is doable with a local IRB. I think you would need open communication with YPrime to ensure they know exactly what sites are local versus central IRB in the local IRB approval timelines. It could be a bit of a challenge for the ad hoc newsletters if one local IRB had changes and the others didn't, but I think those are all things you could work out with communication and working together with YPrime.
Thank you for that answer, Carrie. Our next question here is for Bryan. How does your IRT patient engagement solution work?
Fairly straightforward question. The first part of the patient engagement system really begins upfront at screening or an informed consent, whatever your first interaction would be. And at that point, we're simply allowing the sponsors to ask a patient, number one, are you interested in receiving patient newsletters? If they say yes, then we are collecting that subject's email address. And by we, I mean the investigator would collect that at the site with the patient. That email address, like I said before, gets stored into our database. It's secured, it's hashed, it's encrypted. No one at YPrime can even see that email address. And then from there, emails are sent out to the patient at given intervals. And within each of the emails that's sent out, there's an opt-out link. So if a subject decides that they no longer want to receive the emails, they can simply click on the link that says, opt out of these emails. And from that point forward, they won't receive them. If at any given time they want to receive those emails again at their next subject visit at the site, the sponsor can simply, the investigator can simply add them back in and say that they would like to receive these communications again.
All right, thank you so much for that answer. Our next question here is directed to Lupin Research. What were the biggest challenges to implementation and how did you resolve them?
So I actually think the implementation was actually pretty easy. We did need to work through it with YPrime initially on such things as a format to send the newsletter, how the subject would view it, so in the email body or as an attachment. But once we talked through those items, the build went pretty smoothly. We did choose for ease of use that we use a PDF attachment, and this also helped ensure correct formatting. We did go through a UAT process just to make sure they all looked good, the enrollment numbers were pulling correctly, so that was a pretty easy process as well.
All right, thank you for that answer. And our next question here is for Carrie as well. Why was e-diary compliance an issue for Lupin if you were using this unified platform?
Okay, so just a note, for this study, we actually did not use YPrime for eDiary. We used them for IRT in our newsletter. We went with another vendor for eDiary. I believe our eDiary issues are things that anyone could experience. It was simply ensuring that patients understood the flow of the questions. That way they could answer them properly. I think sometimes, at least maybe for me, we move too fast through the questions and answer them incorrectly, and that can cause follow-up questions to not appear. I also think sometimes when they're subjects at site and the coordinator's walking them through everything, it's much easier than when they get home and they need a little bit of time to practice.
Okay, and our next question here, it's a clarification question. The patient does not need to download an app, correct?
I guess there's a couple ways to answer this. For the case study that Carrie and I spoke about, no, there's no need for a patient to download any app whatsoever. This exists kind of as a separate function beyond the patient's daily use. If we were talking about a study that was using a unified platform, the IRT and eCOA unified platform, two options would exist. One would be the provision devices, where the sponsor in YPrime were to send a number of devices out to sites, or we're seeing a growing use of a bring your own device type of environment. And in that case, there would be a subject downloading an app from the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store.
All right, well, thank you very much for those answers. We've reached the end of the question and answer portion of this webinar. If your question was not answered during the Q&A portion of this webinar, the team at YPrime will do their best to follow up with you after the webinar. Now, please do take a look at this slide for contact information for Bryan Clayton and Carrie Lewis. Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's conference. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers, Bryan Clayton and Carrie Lewis, by following the link in your chat box. We hope you found this conference informative. Have a great day, everyone.